Hey everyone, and welcome back to Too Lazy to Read. I'm so excited to dive into Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell today.
Yeah.
This book has been on my mind a lot lately. It's all about those tricky, sometimes baffling encounters we have with people we just don't know.
Yeah, like when you're trying to figure out,
Right.
if someone's being genuine or like what their intentions might be.
Exactly.
It's so relevant for all of us, but I think especially for young people
Oh, totally.
who are, navigating a world full of new encounters.
For sure.
And, especially for those who are like striving for self-improvement, like our awesome listeners.
Yeah, that's our bread and butter right there.
Right.
Well, I am so pumped to have you here today to guide us through this deep dive.
I'm excited to be here.
You have this amazing ability to connect these seemingly disparate ideas.
Oh, stop it.
And extract these valuable insights.
I'm glad you think so.
So I'm really looking forward to unpacking this book with you.
Me too.
Okay, so let's get right into it.
Okay.
Talking to strangers. What is the big idea here?
Well, the core theme of the book is really exploring the complexities and challenges of understanding people we don't know.
Right.
Gladwell challenges this common belief that we're good at reading people, at deciphering their true intention.
Like we think we're good judges of character.
Right, exactly.
But are we really?
Well, that's what he's questioning.
Okay.
He argues that we're actually wired to be quite trusting, even when it might not be in our best interest.
Okay, so that's interesting. So
Yeah.
it's like our intuition about people can actually lead us astray.
It can.
We'll get into that.
We will definitely.
Let's start with the first chapter.
Okay.
Which is called The Case of Neville Chamberlain.
Yes, a great place to start.
So who is Neville Chamberlain?
Well, he was the British Prime Minister in the lead up to World War II.
Okay. And what does he have to do with talking to strangers?
Well, Gladwell uses him as a historical example to illustrate this point about our default to truth.
Okay, default to truth. What is that exactly?
It's this idea that we instinctively want to believe what people tell us.
Like we give people the benefit of the doubt?
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Chamberlain famously met with Hitler multiple times,
Wow.
convinced that he could negotiate and prevent a war.
He thought he could reason with Hitler.
He did. He believed that if he could just talk to him face to face, he could understand him, see his true intentions.
And prevent a war.
Right, but as we all know from history,
Tragically.
he was completely wrong.
Yeah.
Hitler was not a man of his word, and Chamberlain's trust in him was misplaced.
So it's like he was blinded by his own desire to believe that Hitler was sincere.
Precisely.
Even after meeting him in person. He clung to that belief.
And this highlights the power of this default to truth.
Right.
It suggests that our initial setting is to believe.
Okay.
And it takes a lot of evidence to shift that to doubt.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it can make us vulnerable.
Right.
Especially when dealing with skilled manipulators.
Like Hitler.
Exactly.
So then what can we do?
Well, that's what the rest of the book is all about.
Right.
Gladwell explores all these different ways we can be misled by strangers.
Right.
And he offers some really practical advice on how to be more discerning.
I like that practical advice.
Yeah.
It's all about being aware of our biases
Right?
and being more critical in our judgments.
So it's not just about trusting our gut feeling.
No, it's about going beyond that,
Okay.
looking for other clues and signals.
Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2,
Sure.
which is the truth about strangers.
Another great chapter.
What does Gladwell talk about here?
He introduces us to this fascinating story of Florentino Aspalaga.
Who was he?
He was a Cuban intelligence officer who defected to the U.S.
Wow. Okay.
And he revealed this whole network of double agents.
Double agents.
Yeah, working for the CIA.
Wow, that sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It does.
So Aspalaga was like a real-life double agent.
He was.
Wow. And what makes this story so relevant to our discussion? Well, Aspalaga was so convincing,
Okay.
so charming, that the CIA completely trusted him, even with limited evidence.
So they defaulted to truth.
They did.
Even though they were trained to be suspicious.
Right.
Because he was so charming.
Exactly.
It's like our desire to believe can be so strong
It is.
that it can override even our training or our experience.
Sometimes.
Makes you wonder how many times we've been taken in by someone who seemed trustworthy
Yeah.
but wasn't.
It happens more often than we realize, I think.
Probably.
And it's a good reminder to be cautious,
Right.
especially in situations where the stakes are high.
Like when we're meeting someone new online?
Yeah, or when we're making a big financial decision.
Right.
We need to be careful.
So we've talked about default to truth.
We have.
Now let's move on to another concept.
Okay.
Transparency,
Right.
which is the title of Chapter 3.
Transparency.
Okay, so what is transparency all about?
Well, Gladwell challenges this assumption that we can accurately read people's emotions, especially through their facial expressions.
Like we think we can tell if someone's lying.
Right, or if they're happy or sad.
Just by looking at their face.
Exactly.
But Gladwell says that's not always true.
It's not.
Really?
He argues that this belief in transparency,
Okay.
the idea that our inner feelings are clearly visible to others, is largely a myth.
A myth?
Yeah.
So you mean we can't always tell if someone's happy, sad, or angry?
Not necessarily.
It's just by looking at them.
Right. He points to research that shows that facial expressions aren't always universal.
Okay.
Different cultures might express emotions in different ways.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So like a smile might mean one thing in one culture
Right.
and something else in another culture.
Exactly.
Wow.
And plus, people can be really good at masking their true feelings.
Yeah, I guess.
So even if we think we're reading someone's face accurately,
Right.
we might be wrong.
So if we can't rely on facial expressions, how are we supposed to understand strangers?
That's a great question. And Gladwell suggests that we need to pay more attention to context.
Context?
Yeah, to the circumstances surrounding a person's actions.
Okay, I see.
He introduces this concept of coupling in Chapter 4.
Coupling?
Yeah.
What is coupling?
It's this idea that behaviors are often linked to specific places and situations.
So it's not just about the person themselves,
Right.
but also about where they are and what's going on around them.
Exactly.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand this.
Good.
So to understand a stranger, we need to look beyond their individual behavior and consider the bigger picture,
Right.
the context.
Yes. In Chapter 4, Gladwell gives us a really powerful example of this with the story of sex workers in Jersey City.
Oh, okay. I'm interested.
So researchers found that despite police crackdowns, many sex workers continued to work in the same locations.
That seems counterintuitive. Like, why would they stay in an area where they were at risk of being arrested?
Right. It might seem like they're not thinking clearly,
Yeah.
but it actually highlights this complexity of coupling. You see, the sex workers had established relationships with clients,
Right.
a familiarity with the area, maybe even a sense of community.
So those factors outweigh the risk.
For them, they did.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it shows how much we might be missing when we try to understand someone without considering the full picture.
So true.
And this understanding of context of coupling
Right.
is crucial when we move into Chapter 5,
Okay.
the case of Sandra Bland.
Oh, yeah. This is a case that I remember really shook a lot of people.
It did.
Could you give us a brief overview for those who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. So Sandra Bland was a young Black woman who was pulled over for a minor traffic violation in Texas.
Okay.
The encounter with the police officer escalated, leading to her arrest and ultimately her death in police custody 3 days later.
It's just such a heartbreaking story, and it raises so many questions
It does.
about, racial bias,
Yeah.
police brutality, the power dynamics at play.
All of that.
Yeah.
And Gladwell meticulously examines the interaction between Bland and the officer Brian Insignia.
Okay.
He argues that Insignia's training, which emphasized suspicion and control, coupled with his inability to accurately read Bland's emotional state, contributed to the tragic outcome.
It's so important to remember that this wasn't just an isolated incident.
You're right.
It reflects these broader systemic issues and the tragic consequences of misreading a stranger, especially in a situation where power dynamics are so imbalanced.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it seems like Gladwell is really urging us to recognize the limitations of our judgment,
He is.
the dangers of defaulting to truth, and the importance of considering context in every interaction.
And especially those with authority figures.
Right.
Because those are the situations where things can escalate so quickly.
Okay, so we've talked about default to truth, transparency, and coupling.
We have.
Are there any other key concepts that Gladwell explores in this book?
Oh, there are several more.
Okay, well, let's dive into those then.
Okay, so in Chapter 6, the interrogation room.
Ooh, interrogation room.
Gladwell takes us into the world of law enforcement and how they try to decipher truth from deception.
Okay.
He focuses on the Reed technique.
The Reed technique.
Yeah, which is a widely used interrogation method
Okay.
that relies heavily on interpreting nonverbal cues.
So they're looking at body language, Eye contact, things like that.
Exactly, to determine if someone's lying. But Gladwell points out that there's very little scientific evidence to support the accuracy of this method.
Really?
In fact, it can actually increase the likelihood of false confessions.
Wow, that's pretty alarming.
It is.
I mean, if trained professionals are getting it wrong, what hope do the rest of us have?
Right. It highlights the inherent difficulty in reading strangers.
Okay.
And the danger of placing too much emphasis on nonverbal cues.
Because those cues can be misleading.
They can.
Okay, so Gladwell is saying we shouldn't just rely on our gut feeling.
Right.
Or our interpretation of someone's body language.
We need to look for more reliable evidence.
Okay, I see.
And then he contrasts this with the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Oh, wow.
The mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks.
That was a high-profile case with immense pressure to get information.
It was.
Did they use the Reed technique on him?
No, they didn't. They used what were called enhanced interrogation techniques.
Enhanced interrogation technique.
Yeah, which included waterboarding.
Right.
But despite these intense methods, the information he provided was often unreliable.
Oh, wow.
And potentially misleading.
So even under extreme coercion, it was difficult to determine the truth.
Precisely. And it raises these serious ethical questions about the effectiveness and morality of these interrogation techniques.
Right, because even if we can get someone to talk, we can't always be sure if they're telling the truth.
That's the dilemma.
Okay, so this is all very thought-provoking.
It is. Gladwell is really challenging our assumptions about how we understand strangers.
Yeah, he's making us question everything we thought we knew.
In a way,
Yep.
and that's a good thing.
It is. It's good to be challenged.
Because it helps us to grow and to learn.
Exactly, and that's what this deep dive is all about. So we were talking about the challenges of reading strangers.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly trying to figure out if someone is being truthful or not.
Right, and it's so easy to make mistakes.
Especially when we rely on these gut feelings or these assumptions.
Yeah, Gladwell gives this great example in Chapter 7, the Amanda Knox saga. Oh yeah, I remember that case. It was all over the news. A young American woman accused of murdering her roommate in Italy, right?
Exactly, and she was ultimately acquitted.
Okay.
But she spent years in prison based largely on her demeanor during questioning.
Wow, so they thought she was guilty.
The prosecution interpreted her lack of outward emotional distress as evidence of guilt.
Oh, wow. So they misread her behavior.
They did, and it had a huge impact on her life.
Yeah, that's scary.
It is, and Gladwell argues that Knox's behavior was simply mismatched with the expectations of the Italian authorities.
So it was a cultural misunderstanding.
Partly, yes, her cultural background, her personality, her individual way of coping with trauma, it was all misinterpreted.
Okay, so we have to be careful about our own biases.
We do.
And not jump to conclusions based on limited information.
Exactly.
And then in Chapter 8, alcohol myopia.
This is a good one.
Gladwell looks at how alcohol affects our ability to read social cues.
This is especially relevant for young people.
Oh, totally.
Alcohol is often present in social situations. Yeah.
So how does it affect our interactions with strangers?
That's a good question.
Well, Gladwell explains that alcohol doesn't necessarily make us uninhibited. It actually makes us myopic.
Myopic.
Yeah, meaning it narrows our focus to immediate cues and makes us less aware of long-term consequences.
Oh, I see. So, like, we might misinterpret someone's intentions
Right.
or signals because our perception is clouded.
Exactly. And Gladwell applies this to the issue of sexual assault,
Oh, wow.
arguing that alcohol can lead to misunderstandings and impaired judgment regarding consent.
That's a really important point.
It is.
Alcohol can create a situation where it's just harder to read signals and make responsible decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to Chapter 9, coupling.
Yes, coupling. We touched on this earlier, but Gladwell really dives deep into it here.
Okay, remind us what coupling is all about.
It's this idea that behaviors are often linked to specific places and situations.
Right, not just about the individual, but also the context. Exactly, and to illustrate this, he shares the story of suicide bombers in Lebanon.
Right.
Researchers discovered that most of the bombers were from very specific regions of the country.
So it wasn't just about ideology or like a personal motivation?
It was coupled with their geographic origins.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and this understanding of coupling really challenges us to think differently about human behavior.
To look beyond those simple explanations.
Exactly.
And then in Chapter 10, the Kansas City experiments.
Gladwell tackles this question of whether increasing police presence actually reduces crime.
Oh, that's a big one.
It is.
Especially these days. So what did they find?
Well, they did these experiments in Kansas City
Okay.
where they significantly increased police patrols in certain areas.
Mhm.
And what they discovered was
Yeah.
that while there was a perception of increased safety,
Okay.
the actual crime rates didn't change significantly.
So more police didn't necessarily lead to less crime.
Not in this case.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it challenges this assumption
Right.
that simply increasing police presence is the solution to reducing crime.
Right. Because it's more complicated than that.
It is, and Gladwell argues for a more nuanced approach that considers the underlying causes of crime
Right.
and focuses on building trust within communities.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And it ties back to this idea of context,
Right.
of understanding the complexities of a situation rather than just reacting with a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, so then we move on to Chapter 11, the case of Sylvia Plath.
Yes, this is where Gladwell explores the limitations of trying to understand someone's state of mind before suicide.
Right, because Sylvia Plath tragically took her own life.
She did.
And many have tried to decipher the reasons behind her actions.
But Gladwell cautions against drawing definitive conclusions about someone's state of mind based on limited information.
Right, even when it seems personal and revealing.
Exactly.
So we can't always know what's going on inside another person's mind.
Even those we think we know well.
And that brings us to the final chapter. Chapter 12, Talking to Strangers.
Where Gladwell brings together all these threads he's woven throughout the book
Right.
to offer a final reflection on the complexities of human interaction.
Okay, so what are some key takeaways from all of this?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of humility.
Humility.
Yeah, recognizing that our judgments are often flawed
Yeah.
and that we can never fully know what another person is thinking or feeling.
Right.
He encourages us to be cautious about our default to truth, to consider context, and to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's a tough one.
It is, but it's so important.
Yeah, like,
Because when we're open to being wrong,
right.
we're more likely to learn and to grow.
And to build better relationships with others.
Exactly.
Wow, this has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
It has been.
Talking to Strangers is a book that really makes you think differently about how you interact with people you don't know. And I think it's especially important for young people who are navigating a world full of new encounters.
I agree.
Because it reminds us to be mindful, to be cautious, and to always consider the context.
And to be kind.
Yes, and to be kind.
Because we never know what someone else is going through.
So true. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Talking to Strangers.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been an amazing conversation. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to Too Lazy to Read. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a fascinating book. Until then, keep those minds open, those assumptions in check, and those conversations flowing.